the hype now that we hear about all these U-boot green schemes that are going to save us. And I'm reminded of the great tulip mania in Holland. But anyway, we're told, for instance, that the biggest solar farm in the world, it's called the Sun Cable Project, the biggest solar farm in the world, is going to be built in the middle of the Simpson Desert. In fact, I read one story saying it's already built. It hasn't been. It's backed by a couple of billionaires, Twiggy Forrest and Mike Cannon-Brookes. $30 billion it supposedly will cost. I mean, wow, immediately. I'm thinking, though, from their computer-generated picture, that this farm is the most absolute eyesore. I mean, look at it. 25 square kilometres of solar panels that will last for what, maybe 30 years? That's the industry standard, 30 years, maybe longer, I don't know. And then what do you do with them? When they're out of date, what do you do with them? Think of that. That's a hell of a rubbish tip they're going to. And for what is all this? Now, we're told this electricity is meant really for Singapore, not us. And for all those panels, that's going to supply what you just saw, just only up to 15% of Singapore's electricity. 15%. Probably most times it'll be less because the sun doesn't shine 24 hours a day. Now imagine if the rest of Australia was powered like Singapore with solar farms like that. How much of the country would be absolutely buried under those panels? Joining me for Straight Talk is Mark Latham, former federal Labor leader and now One Nation leader in the New South Wales Parliament. Mark Latham, there is an air of unreality to all this. This hysteria, this fear of missing out from entrepreneurs, all these begging for grants. This Sun Cable project's being sold as a done deal, but iSwitch, Singapore's biggest independent electricity retailer, potential foundation customer for this project, has just pulled out. So what is going on?
Well, you've got to say, Andrew, that vast solar farm, it looks like a Christo art wrapping that's gone wrong. You know, Christo wrapped bridges in Paris and all that. It looks like they've totally wrapped the land as far as the eye can see. But it just highlights how these projects, both solar and wind farms, eat up vast tracts of land. The wind farms have an environmental cost in destroying prime agricultural land and destroying millions of birds, of course, around the world, the birds that haplessly fly into them. But the solar also has the problem, as you mentioned, it goes into landfill, the materials leak into the waterways. There's a problem also with battery storage. The batteries end up in landfill. In destroying agricultural land, destroying bird life, in destroying waterways, there is an environmental downside, and this is rarely mentioned in the debate. In fact, you'd have to say the only honest Green has been the former leader Bob Brown, who complained about the environmental damage of those wind farms in the west of Tasmania, located near his property, that's true. But he had put that on the agenda. There's a few dissidents in the United States, but by and large, the Greens pretend this is sort of a magic wand environmental formula where there's no environmental downside, and that's just fundamentally untrue.
That is so untrue. But you know what disappoints me, Mark? I like Dominic Perrottet, the New South Wales Premier. I do like him. But boy, he's going for this stuff. I'm stunned. I thought he was a really rational guy, but look what's going on.
Well, he's held hostage by Matt Keane. Matt Green, the environmental minister, energy minister, was a disaster there, and they promoted him to be the treasurer. Just this week in the New South Wales Parliament, I battled against a $500 million electric vehicle package that provides subsidies to people who can afford $78,000 cars. I mean, it's not for the battlers, is it? It's for millionaires. And Labor backs it in, the Greens back it in, while otherwise talking about road toll costs and social justice. They back subsidies, publicly funded subsidies for people affording $78,000 cars. And just now, I've come from the chamber arguing against a $3 billion subsidy for untested, uncommercial, probably unsafe hydrogen that has no commercial track record. Again, subsidising billionaires. I mean, if Twiggy Forrest can't, out of his own resources, fund hydrogen, well, obviously it's not commercially viable. You'd never do it. But there's a $3 billion taxpayer-funded subsidy in New South Wales for an industry that's really just on a wing and a prayer and has a whole host of problems with it. It's fundamentally inefficient. The idea that you take energy to create a different form of energy is obviously inefficient, but you lose so much of your original energy form in some of these hydrogen projects, you only end up with 10% of what you started with. So the cost to taxpayer is enormous, and the outcomes for the public, untested, and probably going to be minimal.
See, this is what really gets me. We're told, like Batui Forest, for instance, that green hydrogen made by renewable energies, like those solar farms you just saw, is going to be fueling the new industrial revolution. It's a U-Butte, we'll be an industrial superpower, we'll export this energy to the world. And I'm thinking, look, if it's so great, why am I seeing the New South Wales government, in this case, $3 billion handout? I mean, Apple didn't need to go to government saying, look, I've got this iPhone. If you just give me a $3 billion handout, it'll really take off. Henry Ford didn't go to government and say, look, I've invented a car. Can you just give me a handout? Yeah, they didn't need it. That's the thing. It's the need for subsidies that tell me everything.
Well, I make the point in the Parliament, how would these politicians know? And they're probably in the wrong business. If Dominic Perrottet, a former liquidation lawyer, Matt Keane, a former Hornsby accountant, know all these developments, where the technologies are going to be 10, 20 years from now, they should be in the bond market making a fortune themselves. How would they know from their background any more about where commercial markets are headed than the millions of decisions and knowledge base of producers and consumers every day in the energy market? So the proposition itself is a fantasy, and you can't name a single government instance of picking winners of this sort of crony capitalism, of these public subsidies that ever got a result for the public. So there's no history of government knowing more than the commercial markets and successfully picking a winner. And it'll happen again, whether you're talking about battery storage or electric vehicles in Australia or hydrogen. You can go through the list. What about all the money we wasted on carbon capture and storage, geothermal? The taxpayer's been a sucker for this rubbish, and it goes on and on and on. But if you worship at the altar of climate, you'll spend any amount of money in any inequitable way, hoping, praying, believing with this sort of religious fervour that you'll get an outcome. And a lot of it is just a fantasy.
Absolutely, you're quite right. Kevin Rudd spent taxpayers' money on carbon capture. There's only one project and is going as half as well as it should. He spent taxpayers' money on, as you say, hot rots technology, geothermal. That project collapsed. He spent taxpayers' money on wave generators. They sank off the coast of Australia, New South Wales and South Australia. The record goes on. Mark Latham, I'm afraid you're right. We're going to see more waste in the future. Thank you for your time.